In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to set up trigger zones so you can trigger either text popping up on the screen or trigger an animation to happen or trigger a state change so you can keep track of when something has happened. So what I have here is just a scene with a few walls and an object that is going to be my door. I don't have anything set up on it for scripts or animations yet. And then I have a standard first-person character controller. I'm using the rigid body FPS controller with Unity's standard assets. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a couple of different trigger scenarios. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to make a trigger zone in front of the door, and when the player walks up to the door, if they haven't completed the task they were supposed to do, the door will not open and it will pop up some text to let them know that they haven't done the task. So I'm going to create a cube. This will be my trigger zone. And I'm going to position it in front of my door. And what's important to remember with trigger zones is you want to make sure there's not a way for the player to accidentally walk around it. So I want it to fully cover the front area of the door so the player can't accidentally walk up to the door without hitting the trigger area. So here's my trigger area, and I'm going to set it to isTrigger, and I'm going to turn off the mesh renderer. I want it to be invisible, but so that we can still see it, I'm going to click on this little colorful cube here and give it a little marker so that I can see it. And this marker will have whatever its name is. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this as door trigger zone. And now my label has changed so I can see this is the door trigger zone. This also makes it easier to select because once it's an invisible object, it's very difficult to select it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new script for my player. So this script will be on the character controller. And so I'll select my character controller, and I'm going to drag this player script down to the bottom. Alternatively, you could also hit add component and then search for that script. Two different ways to add it, but make sure you only have one copy of the script attached to it, and make sure you don't accidentally attach it to other things in your scene. So now on my player script, once this loads, I'm going to add an on trigger enter. And this takes a collider. And remember to put an open curly bracket and a close curly bracket. So now in this on trigger enter function, I'm going to check the tag of this. So if the thing we collided with, that's other, if other.tag equals, I'm going to say this tag will be door zone, and then remember what you call it because you'll want to use the same name when you give a tag to your object. So if I collide with the door zone, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop up some text on the screen. And to do that, first let me go ahead and make the text that's going to pop up. So back in our scene, we'll go to Game Object, UI, Text. And if you've watched the previous tutorial about UI elements, you'll know that we want to anchor our text to where we want it to be on the screen so that it will adjust properly with different screen sizes, and to anchor it to whichever edge, or to bind it to whichever edge we want. We'll use this little square here, and I'm going to bind it to the bottom of the screen. So whenever it pops up, it will always be at the bottom of the screen. And this just makes it so that when someone uses it with different screen sizes, it doesn't end up somewhere strange or off the screen or something. So now I will just add the text that I want it to say. and I need to decide what I want the quest for them to be. So you need to place the sphere, and you can see that even though I'm still typing, the text is getting cut off. That's actually because the width of the text box is not long enough, so we can adjust that width. All right, so you need to place the sphere in the loading zone. So I'm going to make a sphere that the player can roll, and they're going to roll the sphere into this zone. And you want to make sure that the text is really easy to read, so make sure you make your font size large enough. All right, so now I have this text object that I want to be able to turn on and off. So in my script, I'm going to make a public variable so I can find that text object. So public, and I'll do a game object. I'll call this info text. So I'll assign that in the scene in a second, but for now, inside of my function, I'm going to say I want to turn this game object on. So info text dot set active true and a semicolon. Save our script, and then back in the scene, if we select our player, our character controller, we can see now we have this empty game object slot. So we can drag in this text object. And by default, we want the text to be turned off. So I'll go ahead and turn that off. And now we can test that. Oh, and we forgot to tag our trigger zone. So don't forget to tag the trigger zone based on what you called your tag in your script. And just let me quick double check. I called it door zone. So we'll add a new tag. And caps is important, so make sure you capitalize it the same way. I prefer not to use spaces in mine, just because it's easier for me to remember if I do it consistently the same way each time. So tag this as door zone, and let's try that again. All right, so now it pops up the text for us, but it's not turning the text back off. So let's go ahead and add that. So in our script, we can also add an on trigger exit. And we're going to have this exact same chunk of code, so I'm going to go ahead and copy it and just paste it down here. And instead of setting active true, we're going to set active false. So now when we run into the zone, it should turn the text on. And when we leave the zone, it should turn the text back off. All right, so the next thing that I want to do is have a zone for the object that I'm going to roll into it. So I'm going to roll a sphere into a trigger zone. So I'm going to make another trigger, and this one is not going to be invisible because I want the player to be able to see it. Let's place this on the other side actually. And I want this to be nice and noticeable, so I'm going to make a new material color. Let's make this one red so that it's really obvious. So once you have a canvas in your scene, it sometimes gets in the way of things. If you notice, it was not letting me drop my material on the cube. That's because my canvas is actually in the way there. So I will rotate around so I can get to it. And now I'm also going to make a sphere. And this is going to be the thing that we're going to roll into that trigger zone. And I'm going to add red to the sphere as well so that it's clear that the sphere needs to go onto the red cube. So the red cube I'm going to mark as a trigger, and the sphere I'm going to add a rigid body component. And pretty much everything that is set up for the rigid body is exactly how I want it, so I'm going to leave it like that. And just so you can see how that works right now, if I'm in my scene, I can run up and push the ball around. I'm having some frame rate issues with the recording software. There, so now you can see I can roll the ball and it can roll into the zone. So now we just need to detect when the ball has entered the zone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have another script, and this is going to be for the ball. And so I'll select the ball and drag this ball script onto it, and then open this up. And so the ball script, I'm going to have, just as before, I'm going to have a on trigger enter. And I will check if the thing we collided with is tagged as loading zone. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a public variable here. It's going to be a Boolean. So the reason I'm making this public is because I want another script to be able to access this information. So this information is going to be stored once I enter the loading zone, once the ball enters the loading zone. I'm going to store this information so that the other scripts can access this information. So this bool is going to be in zone. And by default, it's always set to false, but just to make it more clear, I'm going to go ahead and set it to false when I create it. And then in my function, I'm going to set it to true. So now the ball has this public information. And so what I can do is I can have the player object when I'm walking into the door. I can check to see if this ball in zone is set to true. And so the way that I would do that is I'll need to first tag my ball. I'm going to tag this as ball. And I'm also going to go ahead and tag my other zone for now as well. So in my script, I called it loading zone. So I will also tag this as loading zone. And so now I have my ball, and I'll need to, once you add it, it doesn't automatically set the tag to that. So when you add a new tag, make sure you go back and actually select it. So now I have my ball tagged as ball and the loading zone tagged as loading zone. So in my player script, when I'm checking if I have collided with the door zone, I'm also going to check one other thing. And the way we check two things at once is with these two ampersands. So two ands, and then the other thing I want to check is I need to find the ball. So I'm going to do game object dot find game object with tag, and ball is the tag, dot get component. So let us get the script that's attached to it, and the script is called ball. So I know I'm using ball a lot here, and so that might be confusing. This ball here is the name of the script. This ball is the name of the tag. So nowhere is it the name of the object itself. It's just this is the name of the script, ball.cs, and this is the name of the tag that I have attached to the sphere. And so now I have access to the script, so I also have access to the public variable. So we'll do dot in zone. So there, that's that full line now. So first I check if the player is in the door zone, and then if they are, then I will find the ball object and check if the ball is in its zone. So actually, this is setting the text to true. So what I actually want to do is check if it is not in. So if the ball is not in its zone. So the way you switch something from being true to being false is with the exclamation point in front of it. So this means not. So if the player is in the door zone and not the ball is in its zone, then I will pop up the text. And so if the other case, so we'll do an else if. And so if this statement is not true, so one of these two is false, we don't know which one, but if this one is true and this one is false, then we want to actually open the door. So if other.tag equals door zone, and I don't need to add anything with this a second time, because if this is true and this is false, then when I do with just this else if here, then this is the other case. So this can only, if this part happens, if this first part is all correct, then it'll pop up the text and it'll stop. It won't continue to this else if. This else if only runs if this part does not run. So here's where we would put our animation. And I haven't made the animation yet, so I'm going to go ahead and save this script. And back in my scene, I'm going to go ahead and create the animation for this. So I will create a new animation. And this is going to be door open. And I'm going to put it on this cube. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have the door slide up so the player can walk through it. And if you ever are animating the movement of an object, you'll need to make an empty container for it, because otherwise you'll never be able to move that object in the scene. And I'll show you what I mean here in a second. So for now, I'll actually just go ahead and attach this door open animation. And it creates an animator controller that tells this object to use this animation. And if I go to my animation window, I can add property, and under transform, I will do position. And so what I'll do is at the end here, I'm going to raise it up. So with this keyframe selected and with my red line on this frame, I raise that up. And so now you can see that animation happening. And this will work fine for if I don't ever move this. But if I ever move this object, so here I'll open up my animation window. So if I hit play, I can see that animation happening. But if I was to move my object, let's say I move my object over here, and then I open my animation window and hit play, it snaps back to the position that it was in. So that means I can never move this object somewhere else if I needed to rearrange my scene. So if you want to be able to move it, you'll need to make a parent object, and it's okay to do that after you've created the animation. Just make sure you haven't moved the object at all. So I'm going to create an empty object, and it's really helpful to put it in the same position as the object that you're going to be working with. Otherwise, it's difficult to actually adjust the position of it. It doesn't have to be perfect. It should just be close to where that object is. And so I will call this object door parent. And then I'm going to take the door object and drop it onto the door parent to parent it to it. So now this door parent, I can actually move around, and then in my animation window, I'll need to select my cube. And then when I hit play, okay. So you actually do need to set the parent first. So if you've already animated your object and you did not set a parent for it, the only way that you'd be able to get this to work, I think, is if you had the parent object at 0, 0, 0, and then attach the door to the parent. Now I think if I move the door parent, I think it will work properly. Oops. Yeah. So it's animating itself in reference to its origin, and if you parent it to something that's not at 0, 0, 0, it's changing the origin for that. So the actual easier solution to this is to parent it before you animate it. So I'm going to go ahead and position this parent object at the door like I did before. And then on the cube, I'm going to go ahead and remove the animator component. So right click and then remove component. And I'm going to delete both of these two things so I can just sort of start from scratch here. So I'll first take the cube and parent it to door parent. And if you find it helpful, you can set these to 0, 0, 0, and then select the parent object and position it to where you need it to be. And by the way, this is also how you would want to do it if you needed to have multiple doors that were going to use the same animation. So once again, I will create an animation called door, and make sure you put this on the child object, not the parent object. So with the cube selected, I'll attach the door animation, and then once again go to my animation window, add property, transform, position, and then go to 1 second and position it up. All right, so now we have an animation. And to actually trigger the animation, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the animator window. And you can see the door here is orange. And orange means that it's the default animation to play. And so what we want to do is create an empty state. And this will be our default animation. So we'll set this as set as layer default state. And so now this one is orange. And so this will be the first thing to play, and there's no animation on it, so it won't do anything. So now we need to trigger the animation so we can make a transition from the new state to the door. That was right click, make transition. And we want to add a trigger. So this will be in the parameters tab. So we have layers and parameters up here. In the parameters tab, I will add a trigger. And the trigger is going to be open. And with this transition selected, you can see how it turns blue. I'm going to hit this little plus down here to add a condition, and make sure you uncheck the box for has exit time. Has exit time tells it to exit this state whenever it is finished, and we don't want that to happen. So we only want it to happen when we trigger it. So now all that's left is for our player to be able to reference this door and play its animation. And so we know which trigger zone we have walked into. And so what I'm going to do is actually make a script for the trigger zone. This is going to be called door trigger. And I'm going to attach it to the door trigger zone. And in this script, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a public function. This is going to be a function that will be called from the player script. So we need it to be public. And I will call this function open door. And so I might have multiple places where I have a trigger zone and a door that I want to be able to trigger. Or I might have different objects that I want to animate when I walk into a specific zone. So I'm going to, for my trigger zone, I'm going to make a public game object to reference. I'm actually going to make a public animation or animator because the animator is the thing I want to access. So public animator, and I'm going to call this door. And so if this function is called, I'm going to do door.setTrigger. And it goes in quotes, and it must be spelled the same as you spelled it in the animator. So this was open was the name of the trigger that I used in my animator. And we'll save this script. Then in the player script, so that's where I want to call this information here. So I've collided with this other object, and that object is the door trigger, and the door trigger has the public function that I want to call. So I'm going to say other.getComponent. Door trigger is the name of the script. Dot open door, that's the name of the function. Open and close parentheses and semicolon. Now let's save that script. And the one last thing to do in the scene is to attach the door object to this trigger. And you want to make sure to attach the thing that has the animation on it. So that's the cube, not the parent. So let's go ahead and test that. So first I walk into it without moving the ball, and it tells me I need to place the ball in the loading zone. All right, so now I push the ball in the loading zone, and now when I walk up to the door opens. So now you can see how to trigger animations. Whoa, I fell. You can see how to trigger animations, trigger text to pop up, and trigger information state change. So with the ball going into the trigger zone, we set a Boolean value to keep track of that information. So hopefully that helps you get started triggering events to happen in your scene.